Across 10 seasons of counting cars, Danny the Count Koker built a reputation for turning rusted relics into automotive masterpieces. But behind the gleaming chrome and high-speed haggling, the reality of running a multi-million-dollar shop in Las Vegas involved more than just creative differences. While fans saw a tight-knit family of grease monkeys, court records, and behind-the-scenes departures tell a more complicated story of financial betrayal, unexplained disappearances, and a legal battle involving nearly $75,000 in missing company funds. Today, we step away from the workbench to examine the 5 most controversial tenures in Count Kustoms history, separating the mechanics who simply moved on from those who left a permanent mark on the shop's legal records. When Counting Cars debuted in 2012, the internal hierarchy of Count Kustoms was clear. Danny Koker was the visionary artist, and Scott Jones was the pragmatic gatekeeper. As the shop's manager and bookkeeper, Scott's role was fundamentally psychological as much as it was financial. He provided the necessary friction to Danny's impulse-buying habits, often acting as the no-man in a world of yes-men. To the audience, Scott represented the viewer's own sense of logic, the person asking how much a project would actually cost while Danny was focused on the soul of the machine. However, the psychological strain of managing a rapidly expanding business while being under the constant surveillance of a television crew began to show. Between Season 2 and Season 3, Scott simply vanished. The official narrative provided by the show was brief and sanitized. Scott had moved to Tennessee to be closer to his family following the birth of his son. While this is factually grounded, Scott did indeed relocate and open his own shop, Emmet Customs. The abruptness of his departure left a vacuum in the shop's power dynamics. From a psychological perspective, Scott's exit signaled the end of the startup phase of Count Kustoms. The shop was no longer just a local business. It was a global brand. The loss of Scott meant that Danny lost his most honest critic. Without Scott's grounding influence, the shop's administration became vulnerable, transitioning from friendship-based management style to a more detached corporate structure. This shift, while necessary for growth, created an opening for individuals who didn't share the original crew's history or loyalty. Scott's disappearance remains the first major open wound in the show's history, a moment where the reality of business outweighed the narrative of brotherhood. Scott Jones left a void in the accounting department that needed to be filled immediately to keep the shop afloat. But in the rush to find a replacement, did Danny inadvertently invite a predator into the heart of his business? In the wake of Scott's departure, Count Kustoms hired Joseph Doc Frontiera to handle the shop's increasingly complex finances. On the surface, Frontiera was the professional the shop needed as its revenue skyrocketed due to the show's success. However, the reality was a catastrophic breach of trust that would eventually lead to a landmark legal battle. In 2016, a lawsuit filed in Clark County, Nevada, revealed that Frontiera had allegedly used the company's open-door policy to facilitate a massive embezzlement scheme. According to court documents, Frontiera used nearly $75,000 of company funds for personal luxuries, including airline tickets and personal tax payments to the IRS. The psychological impact of this betrayal on Danny Koker cannot be overstated. Danny operates on a code of old-school Vegas loyalty, where a person's word is their bond. Finding out that a key member of the administrative team was systematically siphoning funds was a devastating blow to the shop's morale. The lawsuit further alleged that the employment agency, Randstad Professionals, failed to disclose that Frontiera had a history of similar financial misconduct. This wasn't just a bad employee story. It was a systemic failure of the vetting process. The betrayal forced Danny and his best friend, Kevin Mack, to confront the fact that their family-first culture had a blind spot. They were forced to adopt a much more cynical view of new hires, moving away from the handshake deals of the past. The Frontiera incident is factually categorized as the worst employment disaster in the shop's history, not just because of the dollar amount, but because it permanently altered the way Danny Koker trusted those around him. While the legal battle with Frontiera played out in the courts, another favorite employee was beginning to feel the weight of the shop's changing atmosphere. leading to a departure that remains shrouded in mystery. Rolley Sabo was arguably the most relatable member of the Counting Cars cast. As the resident detailer, his job was the least glamorous but perhaps the most essential, making sure every build left the shop with a mirror-like finish. His Hungarian accent and high-energy personality made him a staple of the show's golden era. Yet, after season 6, Rolley's presence began to fade until he disappeared entirely. Unlike the Frontier situation, there were no public lawsuits, but the silence from the shop was equally deafening. Psychologically, Rolley's departure highlights the friction between the talent and the business. When fans reached out to Rolley on social media, his responses were often laced with a quiet tension. He frequently referred to his exit as a long story and noted that a return to the shop was up to the others, implying that the bridge had been burned from the shop side rather than his own. Factually, Rolley did not stop detailing. He opened Rock and Rolley Custom Detailing in Las Vegas, proving that his passion for the work remained, even if his relationship with Danny did not. This professional decoupling in the same city suggests a deep-seated disagreement, likely regarding compensation or the demands of the television production. For a man who had been with Danny through the lean years, being excluded from the later success of the brand was a bitter pill to swallow. Rolley's exit serves as a reminder that in the world of reality TV, being a fan favorite doesn't guarantee job security if the behind-the-scenes dynamics shift. Rolley's exit left the detailing bay empty, but as Danny looked to fill the ranks, he began to realize that the biggest threat to the shop wasn't just one individual. It was a culture of turnover that was beginning to rot the business from the inside. While the TV cameras focus on a core group of 5 or 6 personalities, the actual operation of Count Kustoms requires dozens of technicians, painters, and fabricators. Over the 10 seasons of the show, Danny Koker has quietly named the worst employees not through words, but through their absence. In various interviews and behind-the-scenes segments, Danny has alluded to the ghosts of the shop, the men who couldn't handle the Count Kustoms standard. Psychologically, working for Danny Koker is a high-pressure exercise in perfectionism. He is known to demand that a car be stripped back to the frame if a single weld is subpar, a trait that is admirable for a collector but exhausting for an employee. The worst employees in this context are those who attempted to cut corners. Danny has spoken about the frustration of finding Bondo and filler on cars that were supposed to be metalwork to perfection. These unnamed employees represent the struggle of maintaining a boutique's quality while meeting a television show's production deadlines. The psychological toll on the remaining core crew, Ryan, Mike, and Kevin, was significant, as they often had to redo the work of these fly-by-night mechanics. Factually, the shop's turnover rate for non-cast members was reportedly much higher than the show let on. This chapter of the shop's history is defined by the tension between art and efficiency. The employees Danny considers the worst are those who viewed the shop as a TV set rather than a legendary garage. They're the ones who wanted the fame of being on counting cars without putting in the 14-hour days required to make a Koker-approved masterpiece. As the turnover continued and the lawsuit settled, Danny was forced to make a final decision about the future of his brand. Did he finally name his worst employees by simply closing the doors to the cameras forever? The conclusion of the Counting Cars narrative isn't found in a dramatic firing, but in a quiet realization. Danny Koker has spent decades building a legacy in Las Vegas, and the employees he now considers the worst are those who threaten the integrity of that legacy. The final seasons of the show saw a much smaller, more insulated group of workers. Psychologically, Danny transitioned from an expansive leader to a protective one. The betrayal by Frontiera and the mysterious exits of Jones and Sabo taught him that in the high-stakes world of celebrity automotive restoration, the smallest circle is often the safest. Factually, Counting Cars has not produced new episodes since 2021, and while the shop remains open for tours and private builds, the media version of the family has largely disbanded. Danny's final naming of his worst employees is reflected in who he kept, the lifers like Kevin and Ryan. The psychological resolution for Danny was accepting that a business cannot be a family if the members don't share the same soul. The impact of these worst employees was to force Count Kustoms to grow up, to move away from the chaotic, fun-loving garage of Season 1 into a sophisticated, guarded institution. The legacy of a shop is now defined not by the $75,000 loss to embezzlement or the bridges burned with former friends, but by the resilience of the men who stayed. Danny's journey is a factual case study in the price of fame and the difficulty of maintaining old-school values in a new-school world. Now that the dust has settled on the legal battles and the cameras have stopped rolling, one question remains. Was the price of becoming a household name worth the loss of the original family that started it all? How do you think Danny Koker views his legacy today?